Hello and welcome to this presentation session in which we're going to discuss the synergies and the differences between the ePerspectives Digital Enterprise Method and Framework and TOGAF, which is the Open Group Architecture Framework. This presentation is an architectural and technical, if you will, presentation. This is also why it's color-coded as orange. If you're familiar with the perspectives, we have the enterprise perspective color-coded as orange. And we talk perspectives, so when we are in the enterprise perspective, we have the liberty to talk more technical and architectural, whereas when we're in the, for example, blue perspective, which is business, then we have to adjust our terminology and language to the business perspective. I'm Arsalan Rad. Let's start by first looking at TOGAF at a glance. TOGAF gives us the ADM or architectural development method which you're looking at. It has these different modules and phases. We start first by the preliminary phase in which we prepare the organization for successful architecture project. And from now on, you will see this recurrence of the word architecture in all the TOGAF modules, and hence the point that I will be making later about TOGAF's focus on classic enterprise architecture, or perhaps a lot of focus on enterprise IT architecture. We'll get into that. So next module is architecture vision, where TOGAF sets the scope, constraints, and expectations for a TOGAF project. Create the architecture vision and validate the business context, create the statement of architecture work. This is followed by business architecture, in which we develop baseline and target business architecture and analyze the gaps. Then we have the two modules, which are information system architecture and technology architecture. Both of them look at developing and baselining current and target architecture for data, application, and technology. So moving on after this, we look at, TOGAF looks at opportunities and solutions. In here, we perform initial implementation planning and identify which are the key main implementation projects. Moving on is the next module, which is migration planning, in which TOGAF states that we ensure that every stage of a TOGAF project is based on and validates business requirements. Moving on next, it's implementation governance, where we look at analyzing costs, benefits, and risks, and develop a detailed implementation and migration plan, and make decisions in terms of make, develop in-house, buy, and such. Then we have the architecture change management which provides architectural oversight for implementation to ensure that the implementation project conforms to the architecture. Obviously in the middle circle, in the middle of the ADM circle, we have requirements management, which is about ensuring that every stage of a TOGAF project is based on and validates business requirements. Now let's look at ePerspectives at a glance. As we have demonstrated, ePerspectives breaks the entire business enterprise organization, if you will, into key perspectives. We have the business perspective, the enterprise perspective, and the change perspective. We also have an operations and planning perspective, which is a support module, which basically applies to the entire business enterprise and organization. For now, we will not delve too much into that and keep the focus on the key three key perspectives on top. So looking at when we try to see why we have ePerspectives, It's important to see that even the open group itself states that ADM is a generic method for architectural development, and it's designed to deal with systems and organizations and requirements, yes. However, it will often be necessary to modify or extend the ADM to suit specific needs. Now, this is important because I always ask the question to clients and organizations whether they know of a TOGAF project which actually ended up producing business value. I'm not talking about a TOGAF project in which we try to mature our enterprise architecture or enterprise architecture capabilities, because that's something that is very architecture focused and also difficult to measure. So the focus here is in terms of how do we, as TOGAF itself recommends, how do we customize TOGAF and make it tailor-made into a practical and pragmatic method and framework that actually tells us how to execute and gives us very clear instructions in terms of what we do, where, and how. So you could argue that ePerspectives is a practical and pragmatic instantiation of the TOGAF ADM. So if we look at TOGAF ADM and we briefly try to map the ePerspectives artifacts and key modules, we will be looking at architecture, vision, and business architecture, which are both covered by the blue business perspective in the ePerspectives framework. Then TOGAF presents the information system architecture and technology architecture. We'll see that we'll look at this in a much broader scope, because this is where we actually see a big difference, as we will explain. And later, TOGAF has on its left side modules that have to do with migration planning and governance and governance implementation and such, which we cover largely in the third perspective of change. Also the perspective which covers operations and planning, the below perspective, as well as some part of the enterprise perspective. Okay, we will get into the details of this shortly. So the distinctions between the two, if we look at the, as I mentioned, the ePerspectives framework looks at these three different modules of ADM and encapsulates them within the business perspective. Then we have the two IT architecture modules that will be part of the enterprise perspective, and the rest will be largely in the change perspective, but somewhere between the enterprise and change perspective, and also with some input to the operations and planning perspective. So looking at the first perspective, which is a business perspective, if you look at TOGAF, the differences, some of the differences, TOGAF looks at business architecture as one of the three key modules of enterprise architecture, that is business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture. There's a difference here. We in the new way of looking at business architecture that has established itself in the last 10 years or so, we look at business architecture not on par with IT architecture, but very much on as something that drives that. So business architecture comes first, and we should not have IT architecture influencing business architecture. Business architecture really is agnostic to implementation and deployment, and business architecture gives us the foundation on which we're going to build not only our enterprise IT architecture, but also the fitting enterprise planning, resourcing, and organization that should fit this. So that is one of the distinctions, and there's also strong emphasis on customer journey and customer journey mapping within the business architecture. And as you see in every module, we have a key difference as well in approach, that we have separation of concerns, very much a key principle in the ePerspectives framework, which means every given perspective or sub-perspective is only relevant to people, organization, and the ecosystem of that given perspective. So what does that mean? If you look at the left side on the ePerspective, we will see that we have, as correspondent to TOGAF's requirements management, architecture vision, and business architecture. I also need to mention on the architecture vision that this maps very much into, in ePerspectives, we look at this vision as very much as vision and strategy for the entire business enterprise organization, whereas in TOGAF, this is largely focused on the enterprise architecture approach with the scope that TOGAF presents for it. Essentially, we can do a mapping of architecture vision and requirements management to the business strategy sub-perspective that you see here. In here, we have work like strategic development frameworks. We use people use methods such as Lean Sigma, Six Sigma, TQM, supply chain optimization. Use techniques such as balanced scorecards and competitive analysis, market analysis, and such, in order to define and baseline our business strategy. Now, one key difference here is that we are focusing on business strategy as a whole and not only architectural vision and strategy. And we also use techniques such as business canvas modeling, and very importantly, we use techniques such as MIT Institute's X-Matrix from their Enterprise Strategic Analysis and Transformation Method, ESAT. X-Matrix or similar artifacts or similar techniques help us eventually as we develop a strategic capability model, which now becomes our requirements management foundation, if you look at again on the right side. So we have a strategic capability model which has been mapped through an X-matrix to KPIs and metrics. So strategic capabilities can be in fact measured going forward, because everything that we are going to develop on every side will have to be built on the foundation of our business vision and strategy. And importantly, as you see, the boxes that are you see on top, so strategy development and strategy distillation, both of them are regarded as internal artifacts, internal work. So we will not bother any other perspective or even sub-perspective by what goes on internally. This science is only property or relevant to people within business perspective. In fact, in this case, for the sub-perspective of business strategy. So unlike TOGAF, we don't mix everything, and we highlight the one key artifact, which is the strategic capability model here, which becomes the input that is provided into the next sub-perspective of business design. So that lays or encapsulates, if you will, the architectural vision based on the requirements that we have. Now, going to business design, we will be using techniques such as process value stream modeling and customer experience modeling and such, context diagramming, context modeling and such, to develop a business capability model, or a BCM, which is an encapsulation of our business operating models. So how we do things, that is the processes, and the best structure or organization, if you will, that supports it, which is our business capability model. I've mentioned this before. I define architecture as the balancing act of fitting what we do, which is our processes, the services that we provide, into the best fitting structure, right? And that is for me, the definition of architecture that applies agnostically, whether we talk buildings, whether we talk architecture within IT, and in fact, I would argue even in human sciences. So the business capability model is the only artifact that, from the entire business perspective, will be baseline and we will be fed as input to the subsequent perspective. So as we mentioned, the encapsulation of the entire, the three circles that you see here, architecture, vision, business architecture, and requirements management within TOGAF, all of them will be encapsulated into what we call here a business capability model, through which in fact we can also have access to the strategic capabilities as well as being able to measure them. So we have access to the business strategy and vision also through the business capability model. So in here we see very key distinctions and differences in terms of the approach, albeit again, as mentioned, TOGAF is providing a generic way of approaching, and in here, as I mentioned, ePerspectives is providing a specific way, a very guided way in order to conduct enterprise architecture driven transformation or digital transformation. So it's important to remind ourselves of the four-stage evolution of what we call the XCM, which is the X capability model. This, as we have said, is the only central artifact that we need within the ePerspectives framework when we are talking across the enterprise and the organization. So the only artifact we've mentioned, we have only one key artifact, which is a composite artifact. We have one single document in which we see SCM, BCM, ECM, and CCM as they evolve. And this is it. Big difference again between ePerspectives and TOGAF is the fact that ePerspectives will shield everybody from every bit of science that is not relevant to them. So again, if you're in the business perspective, you're mainly concerned with the left side. And what you don't want to do is discuss enterprise architecture or TOGAF or enterprise architecture tooling or those kind of things, really. So to remind ourselves, we had first an SCM when we worked with business strategy, when we capture the high-level strategic capabilities, and then we will essentially stabilize them and then map them to key performance indicators or KPIs and metrics in order to be able to measure them going forward, right? So relate them to the business strategy and see whether we're fulfilling that. Moving forward, we go to the business design phase, in which case we are focusing on the BCM or a business capability model. So we start with a strategic capability model. We use techniques such as value stream modeling, business process modeling, context diagram, context modeling and such, and devise a business capability model, which is based on encapsulating the business processes, the value stream, if you will, or value chains, or there's difference, but the key processes that support our business. Now, there's a distinction between processes that provide value to the outside world and support processes that are there to support the processes that provide value. So we make a distinction between operational processes and business value processes. But anyway, these processes and their sub-services, as they are decomposed, will be mapped into a business capability model, which in fact, as we have said, should lay the foundation for our future organization. So our future digital organization should strive to be organized in adherence to our business capability model. And moving on to the enterprise perspective, the orange perspective, we start with the business capability model, which we said was agnostic to implementation and deployment. So when we are talking BCM, we don't want to limit ourselves by what might constrain us today in terms of our budget, our technology, accessibility, our know-how, etc. We want to design the best business that we can design that will fulfill what our business strategy has defined for us to achieve, and then we will need to optimize it based on our constraints and limitations and possibilities. So we start with a business capability model, agnostic, and then make it deployed and implemented. How do we do that? We start mapping every business capability to the 4 key aspects of business strategy, which we showed how we actually are linked to the business strategy. Then we link it to the business organization, every capability. We look at its IT and technology profile and mapping, and last but not least, we look at its dynamic aspects of planning in the organization. Taking those 4 aspects into consideration, we try to optimize our business capability model's relationship to our enterprise so that it could be best deployed and implemented. And while we are here, we also do exercises such as heat mapping, when we look at every capability and ask the question about the value of that capability, if it gives us competitive edge, it is something that we want to outsource, keep, do it in-house, etc., etc., different lenses as we have shown in the XCM presentation before. And then eventually we devise what is called a CCM, or change capability model, which is a subset of ECM, where we actually focus on the parts where we're going to apply changes. So looking at the next perspective within ePerspectives, which is the enterprise framework, and then we look at TOGAF's correspondence site for this. And now here's a huge difference I would like to highlight. So if you see this, our enterprise perspective, or entails what we can see, what we classically call enterprise architecture and plus. What is the plus? The plus is covering the organization and resourcing as well, right? So this is normally, notionally, something that is often separated or taken away from the enterprise architecture discipline and given to the PMO, if you will, or transformation change planning. And we have talked before about this, that this is not the best way, because again, when we want to devise a solution, it needs to be process driven, it needs to be enterprise architecture driven. So therefore, even the PMO aspects of it need to be enterprise architecture adherent. So what you see here from TOGAF, basically you see the 2 parts of information system technology and technology architecture, and on the left side you see on the top you see enterprise IT, where we have similarly information and data, I would rather say data architecture, application, and technology architecture. Why do I say data architecture, by the way? Because, as I mentioned, business architecture is what drives these ones. And when we look at business architecture, we look at the key processes and we map them into a business capability model. Now, that to me is the beginning, the dawn, if you will, of the information architecture. We'll be mapping what we do and process into structure and eventually data. So coming here, we have data, application, technology architecture. So they are obviously corresponding to the orange and yellow circles that you see. But in here, we have additionally the sub-perspective EP0B, which also covers organizational and resourcing, but hugely important, and this I would argue is a key difference when making ePerspective as what makes TOGAF implementable, is the introduction of the ECM, or Enterprise Capability Model, which basically drives, as the command and control center of entire enterprise, drives what we do and aligns and harmonizes what we do, and also gives us the foundation for making transformation. So this is important. The Enterprise Capability Model, ECM, within ePerspectives is its perhaps most important key artifact. This is where we look at the business capability model, as mentioned, which has been mapped to those key aspects of business and business strategy, organization, which also entails people and locations and such. Then we have the enterprise IT and technology, so it is IT data, what are the applications we have, what data, what infrastructure and technology we have. And last, for every capability, we look at what are we doing with it, what plans do we have for it, in what parts of the organization. So it's a 360-degree analysis of, here's where we can do what-if scenario analysis in order to have a fact-based assessment. So, and also if you use a tool like it's been used in the snippets here before, you see Alphabet by Software AG. So a tool, obviously, so Alphabet by Software AG has adopted the ePerspectives framework and customized for it. Therefore, you can even see artifacts such as X matrix, MIT's X matrix being a possibility or something similar to it to do. Obviously that facilitates things to use tools. But nevertheless, looking at this with a 360-degree assessment, we'll be looking at every capability. We'll look at, for example, invoicing, and we will have a 360-degree. So we can look at, okay, what are the sub-processes, what are the services that are within invoicing? We can look and say, what is their strategic value? How much KPI value do they have? So if you're going to do any changes, we can assess the impact of it on business. Then we can look at invoicing. Okay, what parts of the organization, what people, what locations, what countries, for example, do we have capabilities, people that work on invoicing, and what profile do they have? IT people, external, internal, and such. And also then for the given capability like invoicing, okay, what are our applications? What is the data? Who are the vendors that we have for those applications? So we get into that world and we can look at all the different relations and attributes. Who is my vendor? What's my internal assessment or grading of this vendor? How long do I have a contract or a commitment with this vendor for a given package or application? So I wouldn't, and then looking at the planning, then I will be seeing, okay, I have, for example, Oracle or SAP, and I have still 1 year commitment to one of them or both, what have you. And then we look at, okay, we have currently several projects, these projects that are being executed in these organizations, these locations and geographies, touching about this business value. So by looking at that, we can then, as mentioned, do a 360-degree assessment and analysis and make fact-based decisions. Also, it's important to highlight that ECM is a single version of truth. We don't let enterprise data reside on other places. We let a duplicate, or no, sorry, a reference to them being available to other units. So whatever they work with, they will be singing from the same hymn sheet, basically, the enterprise capability model. And it's not Wild West style where everybody has their own version of the data and change it, and somebody has the impossible task of consolidating all that. So this is a key foundation for everything we do. ECM is a key foundation for everything we do within the ePerspectives framework. So then coming to the last perspective, which is a change perspective. To me, TOGAF here goes a little bit on a blurry line, whether we're talking governance, implementation, or migration planning and such, but there's a very clear focus on architecture here. As you can see, we have EA development and maintenance rather than the enterprise business organization development and maintenance, which is the approach that the ePerspective framework takes. So ePerspectives framework really looks at enterprise architecture as something that harmonizes not only IT and, for example, solution architecture, and takes a somewhat a look also at the business architecture, but goes much higher level and wider than that. So on the change perspective, we look at the subs perspective of change planning, which you see on TOGAF in opportunities and solutions and migration plannings. So if you look at opportunities and solutions, we just looked at ECM, or enterprise capability model, which is our really enterprise baseline. We look at that, we exercise heat mapping, we do a thorough analysis and assessment, identify where our priorities lie, where our constraints lie, based on a 360-degree fact-based single version of truth analysis. And based on this is that we identify opportunities and solution, and we start going the path of migration planning, which becomes a version of what we refer to here as CCM, or change capability model, hence a subset of the ECM, enterprise capability model, but this subset only touches upon the areas in which we're going to implement changes. Very important for in the ePerspective framework is the emphasis on capability-driven solutioning and capability-driven planning. It's, as I mentioned, ECM is a very key artifact, and everything we do is based on capturing those enterprise capabilities, assessing them the right way, and analyzing them the right way, and then making qualified decisions. So this is a very short and one-pager kind of capture of an ECM, in which you can see from ePerspectives ECM. Basically, this is the XCM, so this entails the four XCMs, if you will. So we have strategic capability model captured here, where it's like a light blue. Then we have the business capability model, or business perspective, here within the darker blue. We have the enterprise perspective, key activities, or what we do, orange perspective, we have them here. So you can argue that the orange part gives us the ECM, and then on the left side we have the CCM, or the change capability model. So this is one single document and artifact in which we have our architectural vision access on the left side. So we can look at our strategic capabilities and look at their X matrix correlation, if you will, or strategy correlation, so that we can relate that strategic capability to a strategic value. Then, as I mentioned before, when we move on to the business perspective, we start with those strategic capabilities and develop them into business capabilities, which is the column 5 here, and business capabilities now will be encapsulated into a business capability model. And as we have said before, as you can see here, a business capability will have a strategic contribution value, so we can measure it from a business value point of view. And then the business capability model, as you see here, is agnostic to implementation. When we move to the orange perspective, which is the enterprise perspective, this is where we start from the business capability model capabilities, as you see again on the left column. We extend them to also entail, if you will, APQC, for those who are familiar, or whichever way you call it, process levels 5 and 6 and such, lower level services, and we start mapping them into, as the perspective framework suggests, into application, data, infra, and technology architecture, but also organization resourcing architecture, which you could argue is an operational architecture. So as I mentioned before, in the 4+1 analysis, this is where we can look at every given capability and say, okay, tell me what applications are in scope for you, what data, what technology in scope, and what is the organization, operation, and planning aspects for you, so we can become familiar with that. And this is where we do a exercise of heat mapping. We can look at the applications, we can look at the business capabilities, relate them all the time into business value as well as the application. So mind you, if you look at EP1 here, which is column number 6, an application architecture, this is indicative. We just put something there to show that we look at what capabilities are in scope for that application. And mind you, if we have a sub process, then every sub process that has an application, the same application will be applicable to its super processes, right? So then through this, you can imagine this being a clickable thing. So if you, for example, look at AD52 application there, you should be able to then go and look at different relationships from that application that are deemed relevant. That is to say, for example, show me the vendor for this, show me the price for it, okay, show me the grading of this application internally, but also by looking at the fourth column there, org resourcing, we can look at, okay, what resources do we have dedicated to that? In what locations are they, right? So these are all the key attributes which make the ECM an excellent baseline and basis in order to do our transformation and change. So this is ePerspectives approach to transformation architecture. This I will cover more in the change planning sub-perspective when we present that one. For now, as a high level, we can discuss this, and we look at when we do transformation, as you see down below, we have transformation planning, which then we will be looking at, which will be related to on top, where we look at how we go through different modules of business, if you will, often maybe in terms of business units or business capability. And for each one of them, we assess current and target architecture, and we devise a target architecture for it. So that is the path to transforming organization to a digital organization. However, you see in the middle where we have planning, scoping, and optimize value. When we have the bimodal, or if you will, multimodal transformation element here, when we really can obviously say that we cannot stop everything and start developing everything new according to a digital paradigm. Obviously, we have a lot of legacy in terms of not only our IT and technology, but people, their ways of doing things, and so on. So in the middle, when you see the green and red and entwined together within the path, this is where we look at ongoing engagements. We identify opportunities and quick win possibilities, and it's important to see the third stream, which is IT and EA, as we go through a maturity stage within IT and EA and become more mature and learn things. All of that will be fed into our ongoing transformation. So to the bimodal path in here, we will be able to, from top, for example, learn a lot about current and target architecture for a given capability. Let's call it invoicing. And below, we have stage 1 of maturity for our architecture, so we have better way of approaching from an enterprise and IT architecture point of view, right? And then we obviously have from below the element of transformation and change planning. So we take note of our organization and people we have accessible to do things, and these will always impact what we're doing as ongoing business as usual kind of planned work that we have, as we need to do that on an BAU basis. But then you applying this, we look at from a capability driven point of view, we look at how we can strengthen that path of maintaining what we have today, doing BAU while improving it. So we have these four key different streams of strategic long-term approach with strategic baselining, which is the top one, where we look at every capability until we have baselined it into a valid ECM, enterprise capability model entity. While we have that, then once we have that target implemented in place, or baseline, obviously, I'm sorry, not implemented, but baseline, then it will be much more straightforward to make change planning for it. So this is a multimodal approach to transformation. This is more complex than that. I realize that we can't cover it in a matter of minutes, but why I covered this was to highlight how the ePerspectives framework takes the left side of ADM, TOGAF ADM, very seriously, and make that extremely practical as a enterprise business organization level kind of approach, and not only focus on architecture and enterprise architecture. So key characteristics that ePerspectives gives us, and I'll make a comparison here with TOGAF. We have only one unified enterprise baseline, one unified language and terminology within ePerspective. We have the ePerspective circuit diagram, the one-pager. TOGAF have the ADM circular, if you will, picture. However, for myself, that picture is a little bit more difficult to ascertain perspectives out of what we're doing, where, and such. So that is one difference between the two. Then we go to perhaps one of the most important differences, which is that the fact that we only have one key artifact, which concerns people who go across the board in our business enterprise organization. TOGAF has a wealth of documents, a big thick book with a lot of documents, and what we argue here is that none of that is relevant. So people don't need to learn TOGAF, they need to learn how to put it into good practice. So we provide the XCM, X capability model, as mentioned, strategic capability model, business capability model, enterprise capability model, and change capability model. As I've just demonstrated, all of them captured into one central document and artifact, and only people whose role is more across the board or comprehensive, such as CEO or a CFO or a CIO, or a chief marketing officer, or a head of portfolios, for example. Those are, or naturally as well, enterprise architecture, head of enterprise architecture. These are the people who need access to this XCM in its entirety or parts thereof. I would argue that it's enterprise architecture that really touch upon that in its entirety, whereas other people look at their own part of the perspective within the big XCM. So if you're a business person, from a business perspective, your focus on the XCM will only be on the SCM or BCM, so strategic capability model and business capability model. So that really makes a great change. That means every little piece that we do, for example, in technology architecture, there's a lot of artifacts we produce, right? There are a lot of techniques and work we do. In TOGAF, if you go to TOGAF, they are there. So they're not separated. There's not a warning sign that, please, if you're from a different perspective, ignore this, right? But it's important for us to say, ignore every sub artifact, if you will, that also only serves one given small sub perspective, such as technology architecture or organization or planning or even business strategy. For example, you focus only on XCM, depending on how your role has been defined, and obviously you focus on the small artifacts or the different artifacts that you do within the sub perspective, and you make sure that you feed them into your own perspective so it can be captured into a XCM, and thereafter other people will only access to its distillation, what it means to me from an XCM. They don't have to bother and understand all the little nitty-gritties of what is the technology architecture. And here I did a diagram, technical infrastructure diagram, etc. And this has used this kind of approach and so on. That is something that we protect the rest of the organization from. So that is, we achieve that through these principles of separation of concerns, which is having a perspective-based encapsulation, as I mentioned. So you only focus on your own perspective, or in fact sub-perspective, and nothing else. And as per number 4, we separate clearly whatever is internal within a sub-perspective or perspective from whatever it's external. The inside-out view is what we do inside and how we developed, what kind of techniques do we use, but it only is important in terms of how it leads to us coming with the artifact, with the key artifact or input to the next perspective. So the output for us becomes the input to the next perspective, as we've shown, similar to an electronic circuit traceable diagram. So in here, whatever, for example, as we mentioned within the enterprise perspective, for example, we mentioned technology, application, and data architecture. Now, each one of them is considered internal to the enterprise perspective, right? And nothing about it, therefore, needs to be shared with the business perspective. So the only thing that those sub-perspectives, they do, whatever they do internally, it's not important for us. The main thing is that they can liaise with the enterprise architecture function, which resides in the enterprise perspective, the orange perspective, and make sure that whatever is the outcome of their work validated will be correctly channeled and fed into the XCM, in that case a ECM, an enterprise capability model, and nothing else that they did would be interesting for the rest of the organization to bother about. And you can imagine that this helps greatly in terms of having better focus and not having things all over the place. So this comes from having the basic architecture principle of having high cohesion and low coupling, which we obviously also see in electronic circuits. As we've covered before, we can replace an electronic component or capability such as amplification by simply removing in a digital circuit, which is componentized and encapsulated, and separates internals from external, and has separation of concerns, that has an amplifier that has 8 or 12 or 16 legs or whatever, and we can remove this, replace it by another amplifier which has far better amplification, but then as long as we can keep the right interfaces, whatever 8 or 12, and it can be reinserted the right way into the ecosystem. From the next moment, this ecosystem, the stereo will be performing with better amplification seamlessly without knowing what it hit it. Right, so this is what we want to achieve this is what we have in a digital circuit, and that we want to achieve in a digital enterprise, as we mentioned. This is why we separate concerns into perspectives and sub-perspectives. So that gives us the possibility to protect everybody who is outside our sub-perspective or our perspective, to have to understand and deal with anything we have internally, but they only focus, like an electronic circuit, on the input we provide. So as long as, for example, the blue perspective can provide the BCM, right, we can just even outsource it to another organization and say, well, you do that, as long as we don't care how you do that internally, as long as you can provide us the BCM that is valid and validated and we can work from. So that's very much like the digital circuit analogy that I alluded to a moment ago with respect to componentization. So key features of ePerspective versus TOGAF, to summarize: we have a simplified and approachable method and framework that tells us exactly what we need to do and who does what. It is intuitive and outcome based. It doesn't require people to go and learn a whole bunch of books and tedious terminology and technical terminology. Whatever those terminologies are, If they're relevant to the role that needs to be involved with them, then that role has to keep it to herself or himself or to themselves, and just make sure that they can use that in order to produce their output. And so what I would argue is, once you learn the one pager of ePerspectives, and once you know about perspectives and each perspective, and you can focus on your own, then you don't really have to worry about all those tedious documentations and learning everything for everybody. And we have perspective-based view, not EA view. Again, our focus is very much on the entire business enterprise organization, if you will. So similarly, when I mentioned that when we talk about architecture vision, when TOGAF talks about architecture vision, we talk about business strategy and vision at a higher level. So that's another difference. We have a common language and terminology, only made possible by having one, again, baseline, and by separating the perspective. So again, we will not use enterprise architecture or enterprise perspective terminology like I've used in the presentation today. We will not use that kind of talk and terminology when we are talking to the business perspective, but we have to adjust and talk on the right level based on the interaction point that is based between us. We have one key enterprise-wide artifact, as I mentioned, being the XCM, and that gives us everything, traceability from business strategy and KPIs all the way to strategic capabilities, business capabilities, enterprise capabilities, and change planning. And later on to implementation, and this circularly goes back as a perpetually improving business enterprise organization. Right, so we have the digital circuit diagram model that makes it possible for us to do this. And very importantly, as I mentioned, it's business that is in the driving seat and not enterprise architecture. So we will not use strange architectural terms to guide business, but we have to understand their world. We don't have to understand everything about business strategy methodologies or a canvas modeling or as such, but we need to understand the BCM, the business capability model, the only thing that comes from them, and be able to then work from it. This is very important, as I mentioned, because a lot of organizations spend a lot of money on strategy development, lots of expensive consultants, but normally they don't know what to do with it downstream, because there's no way that they are on different abstraction levels. So what we have is business strategy, we see KPIs and competitive analysis and market analysis and so on, whereas taking that into IT and technology and people and resourcing and making sure that that's traceable. I have not seen it in other frameworks, to be honest, but ePerspectives makes that very, very tangibly possible. As you see, we have a clear traceable path from business strategy to the implementation. So business is in the driving seat. And last is also the facilitation of governance. We really want to untangle a lot of things that we have done here. We don't want to have tedious governance and give some governance model to people and say, get used to it. This is the governance model. I'm sure you would agree with me. We've seen that most of the governance models and diagrams I look at, either very hard to make sense out of or very hard to understand, because again, they're not really related to an end-to-end picture. And like they sort of go all over the place. So if you look at ePerspective, I don't want to oversimplify it, but you can imagine that if you have the digital circuit and the key perspectives, imagine if you just give one ownership, one head of governance to every perspective, and then they possibly could have one owner in their own perspective, one owner of every sub-perspective within their perspective. This is a great way to have control, governance that is adherent to our end-to-end framework and methodology, rather than just hooey and picking up something somewhere that looks impressive on a diagram. So this is, to summarize, that ePerspectives framework I've mentioned before. When we use the ECM, we have the notion of the command and control center with the enterprise capability model, where we look at a 360-degree valid and validated single source of true single version of single source of truth, if you will, reliable, validated, and only one version of it that will not be changed. And that gives us the possibility to have a 360-degree fact-based analysis and build a business case where we fully understand why we are doing such transformation planning. And this is why I mentioned before also that that several CIOs have told me about why they like the framework very much, because of all these things, features that you see here. For example, that it's intuitive and it's spoken in business language. It shields business people from having to learn a lot of technology jargon or architectural terminology and such. But importantly, they have this possibility to trace everything that happens from business strategy, every piece, even a project, even a organization entity can be measured in terms of its business value, right? So I mentioned that before, a true digital organization. In a true digital organization, we don't look at an application and look at its cost as its value, but we have to look at its organization, business, and the operational value as well. Take those into consideration. Obviously, also its IT and technology features, and this is how we make a decision. So from an ECM executive dashboard and command and control center, if you also use tools, you saw some of that in Excel, but we can extract fact-based reports as we want to tailor make them. That gives us clear data. Okay, you want to replace this application, tell me what part of the organization is using it, what's the frequency, what is the business value of it, which countries are we doing, what projects, which ones of them are on track, is there a synergy between these several projects, so we can do some saving and consolidate them. And also looking at the technology we use, get the view on the vendors, on the internal rating of the vendors. All these facts helps us make a 360-degree business case-based, fact-based analysis in order to make a substantiated, business-driven transformation. On that note, I would like to thank you for the time. In the other presentations, we will be covering the different sub-perspectives and perspectives more in detail. So, for example, we covered portfolio planning and transformation planning here. We will cover that extensively in a separate presentation. Thank you very much for the time. Look forward to the next session.